And then what he does here too is he shows us the best way to love others. And I know a lot of people are going to struggle with this, but the best way to love others is to love God first and follow his commands.
Yeah.
Right? Like when we go back to that verse where someone asks Jesus, like, what's the greatest command? He doesn't start with love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
He says, love God.
Yeah.
With all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. And he says the second is like this in that you love your neighbor as yourself. But when he does that, when he says that, he starts with God. You have to start with loving God.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you can't love your neighbor as yourself.
Right.
And if you don't love your neighbor as yourself, then you aren't loving God.
Right.
But it still has to start with loving God.
Yeah, it's another situation that it's much easier to understand after you have children, because my kids do a lot of great things that show their love for me.
Right.
And it's, they make me cards or whatever, and they just give me a hug. They just do things for me that I love, that show me their love.
Yeah.
But I would almost love it. I would take all of that if they would just listen and do what I tell them. You know what I mean?
Right.
I mean, and you don't have to be a parent long for young children to understand it. Like, just do what I'm saying. I would. You don't even have to make that card for me for Father's Day if you would just clean your room when I would tell you to clean your room.
Right.
And it's one of those things. Like I've had these moments as a father. Like, man, why don't they listen to me? Why won't they do what I'm saying? And then God's usually like, yeah, it stinks, doesn't it? Yeah. Like, oh, yeah, you're right.
Yeah. Well, it's funny as you're saying that. I'm like, yeah, cleaning your room is obedience, and making the card for Father's Day is sacrifice, right?
Right.
I prefer obedience to sacrifice.
Right.
Right. And it's important to remember too that, like, when you say that, you give that example, that analogy, you don't want your kids to do as you say because you want control over your kids.
Right. Yeah.
You give them commands because you love them, and these commands are intended to teach them, train them, and get them to a place where they will be self-sufficient, where they will have things that are better as opposed to things that are worse, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's not because we're no fun that we don't want you to stand on the arm of the couch. We don't want you to fall off and hit your head on the table.
Right.
That's why we don't want you to stand up there on the couch. It is for your good.
Right.
And it's the same thing with God. He doesn't tell us not to do certain things because he's no fun. He says, if you do those certain things, you will be hurt by them.
Yeah.
I think I talked about this. I don't know if this was in chapter 4 or chapter 3 when I talked about that. And that's exactly what he says here in at the end of 3. And his commands are not burdensome. And I think that is, again, that's another thing that's taken me a long time to understand and get to, is like,
Yeah.
his commands are not, what he's asking of us isn't really that hard. No. We just make it difficult.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting because, we look at, like, you think about, like, the disciples and the apostles after Jesus left, and they go out and they preach the good news, and then they get thrown in jail and they get flogged, and then they leave their flogging with joy.
Yeah.
Right? And when you think about that, when you look at something like that, you look at that, you say, well, getting flogged is not an easy thing. Getting beaten down is not an easy thing or a light thing.
Right.
But it is if you know the truth.
Yeah.
Right? So oftentimes we look at, like, the worldly perception or the worldly weight of something instead of seeing the spiritual freedom that God has given us. And so when we take on his burdens, it's not that everything will be easy necessarily, but everything will be worth it. Everything will be, you'll want to do these things, right? Yeah. You'll find yourself almost compelled to do these things, regardless of what you may face because of it.
For sure.
Yeah, it is not a burden. And that is the contrast to the legalism of the Pharisees.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you think about it, the Pharisees were like, you got to keep the law, you got to keep the Sabbath, and that became burdensome because how many of these are there? There's 600 and something, and it's like,
right.
Look, we can't even pluck grain when we're hungry. Like, you would rather me starve, right? If it meant to follow the law, and that misses the heart of the law, right? Yeah. So there are things that we should want to do as we love the one we do them for, if that makes sense, right? And it all starts with our faith in Jesus being the Christ, and it is that faith that gives us victory, and in that we overcome the world and its ways, right?